We're going to move on to Ian Simm, Chief Executive, Impacts Asset Management. I've known Ian for a long time, been a great representative of the finance community and spent a goodly amount of time figuring out how to deploy capital into these sectors. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, James. Morning, Mary. Morning, everybody. As James said, I've spent the last 20 years trying to navigate the climate finance labyrinth. I don't quite feel that I've got to the holy grail yet, but making some progress. I think also that I and my colleagues have tried to become what we call multilingual in this area. It's vastly complicated, and if you come with just one language, then you don't really make too much progress. The private sector is not prejudiced against deploying capital to address climate change. However, it is a pretty tough taskmaster, and one of the challenges in unlocking a lot more capital is really for governments, NGOs and the private sector to work together to identify and remove barriers and to help create new markets. That work has started with some great examples of how to do it, but we need to do it a lot more and we need to work together. So those are my sort of two concluding remarks in summary. Just a quick overview of who we are. I started Impacts Asset Management in 1998, actually on the back of a contract to run a solar energy investment fund targeting India, Kenya and Morocco, and led a team which deployed $25 million of capital to try and transform the solar market by stimulating demand for solar panels. At the same time, the German government was busy designing a subsidy program to stimulate demand in Germany and to subsidise supply, and so the market changed in a completely different direction to the one we anticipated. But we certainly learned a lot about how to create projects in emerging markets for renewable energy, and that was back in 1998. So our firm today is managing money for about 100 institutional investors. It's entirely private sector. We hold ourselves out to be experts in interpreting the investment opportunities around environmental markets, many of which are linked to climate change. They're listed here in the slide. They are growing very rapidly. They are large. There's about $4 trillion of market capitalization of companies around the world active in these sectors, and institutional investors are very interested in finding ways of accessing these growth opportunities. One of the challenges for this topic is to really try and divert or identify money that could be diverted from the vast pool of private sector money out there towards addressing climate change issues. How much money is out there? Well, it depends how you count. This is a fairly recent summary. It's arguably a bit conservative, $76 trillion. If you imagine that that's growing at roughly the rate of global GDP growth, then that's growing something like $1.5 trillion a year, which is roughly speaking 12 to 15 times the entire global overseas development budget. So that's an interesting context, I think, as to how private sector capital could make a massive difference to addressing climate change if we could accelerate mobilization. However, the language is really quite opaque, and this somewhat deliberately dense slide is a way of just demonstrating that when you talk to those who run pension funds and insurance companies, they don't talk about climate change in the first 3 hours of their meetings. They typically talk about inflation, interest rates, commodity prices, political risk, and they think about allocating their assets in a framework that is intended to deliver returns that can pay pensioners and can meet insurance claims. So in that context, climate change is generally perceived as a medium to long-term risk by the average pension fund and insurance company manager. Having said that, though, as many of you will be aware, there is increasing frustration with the risks and potential returns from both the stock market and from government bonds, which in aggregate are typically 70 to even 95% of most investors' portfolios, and therefore there's increasing interest in infrastructure, in private equity, and in real estate. And those three areas in particular are, of course, very ripe for climate change related investment opportunities. So I think there's great scope for optimism, and there's many initiatives around the world from some of the large Australian superannuation funds, from the Californian large state funds, from many of the funds in Europe to consider climate change related investments in the context of infrastructure, private equity and real estate. I heard the number $70 trillion this morning for the next 15 years for infrastructure. I'm sure there's many ways of skinning the cat. This number is 41 trillion, but who cares? It's a lot of money, and it's definitely it's definitely worth an investor looking seriously at what the opportunities are at a granular level. And clearly a big recipient of that money when it starts to or continues to flow is going to be new asset creation, particularly around developing countries, emerging markets. And new asset creation means a huge opportunity to create assets that are designed, to the point that was brought out in the previous session, for climate resilience and high sustainability factors. So there's plenty of market opportunity, which is why the private sector should be very excited about this opportunity. There are, however, reasons to be cautious about climate change and particularly the development of infrastructure in emerging markets. This has already been touched on to some degree, but political risk is a major issue for investors in infrastructure. Typically, those assets can't be sold for many years, if not decades, and therefore the risk that the government can renege or would renege on its promises is a major issue for investors. There tends to be a preference to stay out of markets where there's any sort of risk of government policy change. Rule of law and property rights are major problems for many emerging market countries when it comes to attracting private sector capital. Those issues can be addressed with specific technical assistance backed up by local expertise, training local people as to how to put that sort of framework in place. James knows a lot about that from his own experience. The absence of stock markets means, in many countries, means that the route to liquidity for investors is quite often opaque. And so stock market development is a key point. And currency convertibility is also a major issue. And that's where some of the multilateral agencies are helping through providing either direct assistance or indirect assurance that they would step in if there was a currency convertibility problem. Interestingly enough, some of the recent bad examples of infrastructure investments have come from Europe. So many of you will be aware that Spain has retrospectively changed the tariffs that it pledged for solar energy, and Italy has recently done the same thing to a lesser degree. The Czech Republic put taxes on solar projects, and even in Ireland, sorry Mary, but the planned change for rates in certain parts of Ireland is undermining confidence in the wind industry. And that's a major issue for many of us that invest in Europe at the moment. So those are all European examples, which is deliberately chosen to illustrate that this is not a sort of emerging markets problem. It's just a general problem for structuring infrastructure markets. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just move to a few recommendations. I think governments have a crucial role to play in shaping markets for acceleration of infrastructure investment, addressing market failure. We can come on to some of the details in the Q&A. I think specific initiatives, just building on what Namita said around guarantees for infrastructure-related finance, first loss facilities, soft and patient capital that's willing to take part or all of the first loss is helpful in bridging the gap, and innovative insurance packages can make a big deal. Or make a big contribution rather to facilitating this transition. So I think the ability of governments to address market failure, coupled with continued innovation, both from the finance professionals themselves, but also from those in the public sector who work on the interface with finance, particularly through the multilateral development agencies, is essential. So I was touched by Mary's reference to Bishop Desmond Tutu. I think I feel of myself as a prisoner of hope, but a slave to the detail. And if there's one thing that I would encourage everybody in this room who's passionate about solving climate change through mobilising capital to do, is to become multilingual and to really drill down into the detail of what it is to navigate through that labyrinth of climate finance, because it is possible. There's many great examples, but it takes diligence, time, patience, optimism, and perseverance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a really good phrase, particularly for a research-based institution that needs to be good and disciplined about the analysis and the data that we use to tackle these problems. I'm going to ask you a question based partly on my experience, but partly also on the essence of your presentation, which is that we clearly have plenty of capital to draw on, and we have all sorts of grand commitments for its end use. But we seem to have a flow problem. And you've mentioned a couple of ways in which one could improve the flow, not least by combining certain types of risk transfer product. But I wonder what else we might add to this conversation about how you improve the flow from the capital font, if you like, to the places where capital could be used to deliver these end objectives of reducing greenhouse gases and improving sustainability. What are we missing that we need?
I think without being too pejorative or critical of specific initiatives, I think there's too much attention being paid to mobilising public sector capital to address climate change problems, rather than focusing on addressing market failure and removing the barriers for private sector capital to flow. And I touched on some of these in my comments, but I think the idea of really strengthening property rights and the rule of law, so that if there is a problem, that the investor can trust that they go to the courts, they can get a fair hearing within a respectable period of time, and there's a good chance of getting their money back if their case can be proven. That's not possible in many countries, as you know. I think that the absence of stock markets means that the route to liquidity is uncertain. That really just raises the barrier to entry. And then I think this idea of political risk insurance and guarantees can be a hugely multiplying force for relatively small amounts of capital, rather than raising tens or hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be directed into projects, hopefully to create additionality, but actually, I think as you're implying by your question, reaching a barrier because the other partner in the tennis match is not willing to play.
Exactly. We'll come back to these sorts of issues. We'll also be looking to where capital can be found domestically. There's a very good examples in India, so that we understand where the financial resources are to solve these problems, and they're sometimes in places that people don't quite understand. But now we're going to move to Jakob.